So again, welcome and thank you for joining us. We're going to have a really interesting discussion today. My name is Jonathan Belsley and I'm the program director for our Tulsa District Council. And I'm a real estate professional and developer here in this region. So ULI, with 100 people attending here, some of you, this may be your first ULI event. And our focus is to bring together leaders from across the fields of real estate and land use policy to exchange best practices and serve community needs. Now, the way I think of ULI is a sharing of those concepts and policies that work to invigorate and enliven our community. And even more than that, it's the relationships that we build together. And I've heard numerous stories just locally of deals being conceived and done through new relationships in ULI, and I've already experienced it myself by doing some work with folks in Oklahoma City. So, you know, during this time of uncertainty, we're pleased to be able to provide this kind of content virtually and hope that it continues to bring value for you, and we couldn't do it without our sponsors. So thanks so much to you sponsors who allow us to do this. Many of you know Matthew Petty. So let me go ahead and do the requisite little bio for him. I had the pleasure of meeting Matthew on our Pier City trip that we took to Northwest Arkansas last September. So Matthew is the principal of INFILL Group. He's got a keen interest in the future of cities and has a generalist's skill set for reshaping metropolitan landscapes. From municipal budgeting and consensus management to site planning and cash flow projections, Matthew has demonstrated success in public and private sector planning and development projects. He is serving his 10th year as alderman in Fayetteville, Arkansas. He's the chair of the Transportation Committee, which advises the mayor on all transportation-related matters, as well as chair of Advertising and Promotion Commission, which funds quality of life initiatives as a component of broader tourism goals. Matthew is also founder and principal of INFILL Group, a planning firm which also develops small-scale residential and mixed-use real estate projects. In addition to his own projects, he provides preliminary financial projections and site assessment for developers of infill projects in the South and Midwest. So with that, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. Excited to be here today. And thank you for having me. Also joining me is Matt Hoffman, my architectural partner in developing this concept. And there are a couple of slides in here that I'm going to give the floor to Matt to talk about because he knows those topics better than anybody. I've been privileged to work with Matt as an architectural partner, and also he's served on our planning commission in Fayetteville for a number of years. And so we really do get to work closely together on all things city. It's been a pleasure to be an elected official, and part of that is where this idea came from. You know, as a planner, we all hear from developers and planners alike about how frustrating entitlements can be, getting a project approved can be. And of course, we have high hopes for our cities. And we wanted to come up with a program that would work at scale. It would work at scale anywhere, not just in downtowns, but across a wide variety of landscapes that we have. And we think we've come up with something that works. We call it pattern zoning. Pattern zoning is a novel technique. It's brand new. At its core is the idea of pre-approving buildings that we want in our city, and standing up some programmatic elements around those pre-approvals to make it very easy to execute development. Let's talk a little bit about it. First, I got to say we're really honored. We were recognized by the Congress for New Urbanism just a few weeks ago for this project as advancing the goals of form-based codes and everything else that we've been trying to do as urbanists. We feel, like the jury, that this is a critical next step, but you're going to hear how this can be implemented almost anywhere. You don't need to have a great code already to do something like this. It can work in suburban formats, main streets, and in other neighborhoods and other districts that are unique. And we hope that we can show you how, maybe inspire you to do something like this in your own city. For our part, we envision pattern zones as a technology, much like other coding, like form-based codes. We think of this as a technology that a lot of different cities can use. And of course, we're eager to help you, but we also see that there can be a community of practitioners that takes this idea and applies it with their own clients. And we're eager to help anybody that wants to improve communities for themselves or for their clients with this tool. At its core, we had a theory that inspired this. The theory is that developers make decisions based primarily on three things: what's convenient, what's marketable, and of course, what's allowed. But a lot of planning departments and cities across the country don't understand this completely. A lot of us believe that if we can only change what's allowed, if we could only get that piece done, then the development community would respond and we would be able to achieve the vision that we memorialize in our plans and in our watercolor images and in our renderings. But if we face the facts, a lot of times those plans don't bear the fruit that we hoped for. And that's because we haven't made those visions more convenient to execute. Even if they're marketable and even if they're allowed, we have to make them more convenient, or we just won't be able to achieve that vision. And so that's what we wanted to do with the pattern zone, is we wanted to make it so easy to develop a good project that even somebody who doesn't have development expertise could execute something that the community could be proud of and that they could be proud of. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. First, I'd like to show you why we're compelled to do this in terms of the bottom line. These are real numbers taken from a project in Bryan, Texas. And Bryan, Texas is going to be the primary case study that we talk about today. This is from a fourplex in their downtown. And so we're trying to highlight here what the potential savings of this program is on a project by project basis. We've been able to save applicants who use this the architectural fee, and we're optimistic that in future projects we'll get an opportunity to save them on the engineering fees as well. But notice here that we haven't assigned any time, any money, any value to this time saved in design and permitting. That's substantial, but everybody counts their time a little differently. The bottom line is, for a fourplex, you could expect to save somewhere around $8,000 to $12,000 per unit if you use a pre-approved building in a program like this pattern zone. We've corroborated that with more than a dozen interviews with builders and developers, and of course with our own proprietary models that we use to project cash flows. And the response that we've gotten in communities that we're working in, like Bryan, Texas, and now Claremore, Oklahoma, in your area, really corroborates what we thought would happen whenever we started out developing this idea. Builders and developers are absolutely eager for something better. And I know that there are a lot of people on this call today who will recognize that desire within themselves. You probably have your own experiences that have led you to be a little bit frustrated. I'll give you a quick overview of the program. It's actually quite simple. We start with a set of building types that we might like to see in the city that we have a desire for. And we pre-approve a subset of those on a street-by-street and a parcel-by-parcel basis. So not only is there pre-approval at the building permit level, but there's also a pre-approval at the zoning level. And we'll show you our mechanism for doing that a little bit later. The next step is that this is a voluntary program, and this is perhaps the most important feature. Because the program is voluntary, because applicants opt in, it means we're striking a deal with applicants. And the deal is, in exchange for the savings and time and money, applicants have to build these buildings as designed, and they have to meet supplementary site criteria. The voluntary nature of the program means that a planning department can require of applicants who use this program to do things that they're not able to make mandatory for all projects. Maybe for political reasons, or maybe for statutory reasons. For instance, in Texas, the state legislature last year passed a law that prohibits municipalities from enforcing design standards on single-family homes. But with respect to a voluntary program and a pre-approved building that's a part of that program, those design standards can still be enforced because the program's voluntary. And we can do the same thing with site standards with respect to things like frontage requirements, driveway widths, street trees, and a whole host of other stuff. So the voluntary nature of the program is really where a lot of the power comes from. Finally, the program is expedited. So if, as an applicant, you're willing to commit to constructing the buildings as they're designed and meeting the supplementary criteria, then you can have an expedited permit that's a combined building permit and site development permit. And this is the kicker. It has architectural plans attached to it. That is an incredible value. And right away, somebody can go to a contractor to solicit bids or to start building. In Bryan, Texas, their standard period for turning back comments on an application is 10 business days. And because these are pre-approved, we're optimistic we'll be able to issue a final permit within those 10 business days for somebody who is opting into this program. I want to show you a little bit about why we're so keen on this as a mechanism for neighborhood development. You know, I think that there are there is a predisposition among a lot of city leaders to look at things in terms of bulk effects or bulk data. What I mean by that is we might look at a district and we might assess the real estate demand, and then we might conceive of a single project to meet that demand. But that has some important ramifications. What if the project fails in the middle? Then we've impacted, if it's a very large scale project, we've impacted a much larger area of the community, even if it's just delayed. Not only that, but when we have to scrape a site and prepare it for a large scale project, we lose the tax revenue that's associated with what was already on the ground. And this is to say nothing of the political concerns that we see in many residential neighborhoods, which are of course very substantial. So we propose in Bryan, Texas, an incremental approach. We propose it so that the existing tax revenue sources would be maintained, and so that the residents of these neighborhoods would still recognize their neighborhood even when development had run its entire course. Before I explain this slide, I want to tell you that we're going to make these slides available. These are excerpts from the plan itself. And so you don't need to squint at your screen to read these. We'll make it available so that you can review these in detail. What we're showing here is a trajectory, is what a neighborhood might look like every few years over the first 10 or 15 years of redevelopment. Nothing happens all at once. And in the neighborhoods that we were working with in Bryan, Texas, the average density was about 3 units per acre. That's not enough to support transit systems. It's not enough to support pothole repair. And the goals of the community just aren't able to be met with the revenue that they're getting from this type of urban format. We think that after the first 5 years, after some catalytic investments from Brian, which was their plan to make some street improvements, that some of the pre-approved buildings would be built on a pilot basis, or maybe in the first round after the pilot. But because we've carefully designed the buildings to be contextual with the neighborhood, along with the site design criteria, that neighborhood should still feel very familiar even when the density doubles to 6 units. Even when the density doubles after a few more years to 12 units, that neighborhood should still be recognizable then, and it should still be recognizable even later when corridor developments follow on to what's happened in the neighborhood and the population growth. This idea of the familiarity principle is something that we are really proud of being able to stay true to in the pattern zone. We're not against new architectural styles or new materials. We think they have a place in the urban fabric, and we're not making any argument for more traditional or more recognizable styles. But if we're going to pre-approve something, they should be very familiar to the community so that they know what to expect. How many times have we heard during a rezoning or a platting decision, oh, well, that's all well and good what you're talking about, but how do we know what it will actually look like? How do we know that we'll actually get the benefits that the comprehensive plan talks about? Well, isn't it a fact that we don't know? Those fears are legitimate, and we have to reconcile them in a lot of cases in order to even earn an entitlement. And that's to say nothing of the good faith relationships that we really want to have with our community. So we committed to finding and designing buildings that would be familiar for pre-approvals, so that whenever this happens and whenever we see the next 10 or 15 years of development, the neighborhood isn't entirely different. And long-term residents will still recognize it, can be proud of it. And it turns out that when we run the numbers, we actually achieve more tax revenue from this incremental approach than we do the cumulative revenue from a large-scale approach. So it's been quite fascinating, quite compelling for cities that we work with. We started with a list of building types, and then we narrowed it down through a process that engaged the community. And I want to turn the floor over to Matt Hoffman from Miller Bosca Slack. Matt did almost all of the drawings that you see in this slide deck today, and was the principal architect on each of the buildings you're going to see. But more than that, Matt has been essential to developing the programmatic elements and making sure that what we've put into practice matches up with our concepts. And this family tree diagram is one of the best ways to introduce that. Matt, why don't you take the floor?
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. Again, I'm the Director of Urban Design for MBL, Architecture and Planning, and we're really excited to be partnered with INFILL Group on projects like this right now in 3 different states. This is a diagram that we developed basically to answer kind of the first and most asked question that we always get when we introduce this concept, which is some version of, hey, you guys are only doing 4 buildings. How is everything not just going to look the same? So to answer that, I think you have to sort of understand the difference between a building type and a building design. At the very back row back there, what you're looking at is basically the 4 fundamental types. And the decisions that we've made at that stage are really sort of skeletal. So we've figured out where the stairs are going, the vertical circulation, and basically where the units are going. And then as we move forward through the diagram, that second row sort of becomes kind of like the essential organs of the building. So at that level, we're coming up with optionality for things like, how can we reorient the building and get front doors on different facades to get different types of frontage? Do we have one bedroom and 2 bedroom units? Is it a single house or is it a duplex? So kind of basic optionality. The third row is where we start getting into that architectural expression that everybody cares so much about. So that's where we're looking at skin deep features, literally like materiality. Is it brick? Is it fiber cement? You know, can we play with different roof forms? What different types of expression can we come up with? So you can imagine that the pattern book that we ultimately produce for a community winds up sort of playing out like a choose your own adventure novel. There's a lot of different endings to the story. And finally, that last row that you're seeing where, you know, all the buildings are sort of ghosted in, what that represents is a process that we've developed as a planning tool that allows for both major and minor modifications to be asked for and approved by applicants. So at the end of the day, you know, you start out with 4 fundamental building types, but you wind up in dozens or more actual architectural expressions that face the street.
Let's show you an example, and then we'll give you an overview of what we included for Bryan, Texas. First, let me say that we start out with the question of what building types does this particular project need? We have a concept that we call feature completeness whenever we start. And what we mean by that is, what buildings would we need, other than civic buildings like schools, city halls, and churches? What buildings would we need to create a complete neighborhood that included all of the functions that should be in a neighborhood? And that list of building types is 10, 11, or 12 building types long. And then when we look at the particular project, the particular need for a community, we shortlist that down. So here in the Midtown area in Bryan, Texas, we had a predominantly residential need. Housing demand was the major driver for the plan. But we also had some desire from the community to improve the commercial corridors. And so we have 3 residential buildings. Then we have a 4th building, a walk-up building that can be constructed in a variety of formats, including a mixed-use format to be flexible. And it's really that flexibility that is key and that's unique to the pattern zone. Let's show you that in an example with the cottage. If you'll notice at the bottom of the screen here, we have 4 renderings of this building. And there's something different about each rendering. The one on the left is the prototypical cottage format. It's a modest cottage. And we took inspiration from modest cottages that were cherished and loved in the community itself. But we knew that we wanted to be able to do more with that small housing format. It's very flexible to a lot of different types of households and a lot of different types of sites. And so we wanted to do a lot more with it. And as you move right across the page from that single story cottage, you see that next we have a garage apartment suitable for a backyard. Next, we have a cottage duplex where the floor plan has simply been stacked. And finally, we have an elevated cottage duplex that has a double porch, much like what you might see in Charleston, South Carolina. But those are the building formats, and the flexibility doesn't stop there. We also have site formats. This is a building that by virtue of the pattern zone is permitted to be constructed as a primary dwelling, as a backyard unit, or as an aggregation of units in a cluster housing development or in a pocket neighborhood format. Each one of these comes with options in terms of what can be changed to suit a builder's particular sensibilities. Now we do draw a line. They can't change anything. They can't add a whole nother wing to the structure. They can't dramatically alter the proportionality of the windows or the doors. There are certain things about the front of the building that we think are very important. And that's the offer in the pattern zone, is we propose saving you time and money. And in exchange, you're going to construct these to the standards that have been detailed in the drawings and in the supplementary site criteria. This is very flexible. From one cottage, one building type, we have 4 buildings constructed across 3 different site formats. So there are a lot of different ways to do this. And by the way, we did this in a community that doesn't allow backyard units by right, that doesn't have a process set up for pocket neighborhood formats. But the pattern zone pilots all of those for these pre-approved buildings in a way that can be extended more generally to other buildings whenever the community is more comfortable and can look at the examples that have been constructed by virtue of the pattern zone. Matt, why don't you take it again and you can talk about the rest of the 3 buildings.
Sure. Yeah. And real quick on the cottage, back to the building type idea, that the kind of building technology that allows that building to be so flexible is the notion of a stacked flat apartment. So doing something simple like pulling the vertical circulation out of the floor plan is what allows you to stack those things and build them like Legos and turn it into so many different formats. The Flex House is a really interesting building that's specifically tuned to the demographics that we found through our market study with our partners RCL Co. there in Bryan. Basically, what that does is with a simple kind of 4-digit renovation, that building can flex between a 1/1 duplex and a larger single family house. And what that allows us to do is address people who are looking to downsize and maybe come up with an income generating unit without actually leaving their own home. Or it allows a young professional couple to buy one of these houses as an investment and lease out the upper level, knowing that they can grow into that as a larger single family home later on when they want to grow their family. Go to the next slide. The apartment house is something that generated a lot of discussion, a lot of positive feedback from the community. Bryan, Texas is, you're probably familiar with it. Bryan College Station is where Texas A&M University is. And so there's an incredible amount of pressure for student housing. And what ends up happening is they've had this problem with what they call stealth dorms, where people come into existing single family neighborhoods and they build buildings that technically are single family houses, but they're 5-bedroom, 5-bath houses that are really out of scale with the existing sort of low slung single family fabric of ranch homes there. So we wanted to offer an alternative to that. The apartment house looks like a 1.5-story building, but it's actually a triplex, and it has the same sort of unit capacity. It's got 5 bedrooms. So we're able to offer to meet the demand for housing, but in a way that is more architecturally appropriate to neighborhoods that are existing. The last one is the Midtown Walk-Up. This is kind of the ultimate transformer building. You wouldn't believe the number of combinations that you can come up with on a building like this. It's basically 4 to 12 units, 2 or 3 stories, 1 or 2 bedroom units. You can do it in a commercial format as you're seeing below. And you can do all of this without an elevator and with just 1 stairwell. So it's an incredibly sort of thoughtful building that we actually didn't come up with this building type. This is something that's been floating around in urbanist circles for a while, but we think it's a great addition to the pattern zone. And incidentally, this building is also unique in that depending on the architectural act that is relevant in whatever jurisdiction we're working in, this is the one building pattern that will actually get us above the threshold, which requires an architectural stamp, and that it actually requires the applicant to secure the services of a licensed architect. So that's another thing that we've built into this, is the ability to work with community partners and actually bring in local architects to build certain versions of these patterns.
And perhaps one of the most important components of this program that's entirely under the hood is the way these buildings have been licensed. It can't be done on a standard license because they're to be reused and because we can't be there every time it gets built. And so we've had to carefully navigate that, but we think we figured it out, and we think we figured it out in a way that will work in other states. I think something that's really interesting here that we would want you to notice is, if you compare this project to what we might provide to a private sector developer, we would be insistent that you tell us what the building program needs to be. We would want to know how many units and how many bedrooms in each one of those units based on your own analysis so that we could get to work. It's a lot different with the city, and we've tried to do something that's a lot different in this pattern zone. You'll notice that Midtown Walk-Up, when Matt says that it can be constructed all those different ways, 2 stories or 3 stories, different bedroom counts, mixed use or completely residential, That's something that the city needs and something that we were very careful to be able to provide on each of these types. There has to be flexibility because we don't have a developer sitting across the table telling us exactly what the program is. This pattern zone has to work for a wide variety of conditions. You remember at the beginning, we talked about the voluntary nature of the program and how powerful that could be. These are some diagrams that visually show what we are able to do with the supplementary criteria that's being codified. For instance, we're able to require the parking to be either to the side or to the rear, and we're able to go farther than that. If it's put in the rear, we're able to require a cross access easement so we can retrofit alleys into the historic plats where they don't already exist. We're able to do things like make sure that curb cuts on the street are minimal, that wider sidewalks are required, or that street trees have to be planted, or that perimeter trees have to be planted. We're able to do a lot of things that for either political or statutory reasons the city hasn't been able to mandate for all projects generally. And what we've tried to do, even though we've had to codify those recommendations in narrative, just like any other code, we've produced a pattern book for the city, like other pattern books for other cities, but with so much more under the desk to back it up. So an applicant can walk into a planning office. If their parcel qualifies, they can review that pattern book with the planning clerk, and they can actually learn which buildings are already pre-approved to do. They can see the entire process from beginning to end, so they understand what parts of it they still need to complete, and they can see right away what the expectations, the elevated expectations for their site are going to be. Of course, they still have the opportunity to do something completely custom. There's an existing process for that, and any city that implements a pattern zone should really take care to preserve that. We want people to be able to do things that they aspire to do, even if they're a lot different than what is out there. But projects like that just require a little bit more review than the expedited system that we've set up here with pre-approvals. This is a big part of how these are implemented. We could just pre-approve buildings. That can be done in the building safety department. In most municipalities, it doesn't even take any legislation whatsoever. That's an administrative decision to work with the building safety official to review projects and to issue contingent approval letters, just saying that they're ready to go. We can do that. Some suburban developers have done that in the past to accelerate their closing times, and there are 1 or 2 cities that have made an attempt to do that with single-family structures. Because we wanted to do so much more with a range of building types, we knew that we would need to have some other components. And so what you're seeing here is a pre-approval map. This isn't really all that different from a regulating plan, except for that this is specific to the walk-up building. What I want you to notice here is you have the purple, which shows where this building can be constructed in 3 stories. After visiting with neighbors and planners and city executives, we had to make revisions. Of course, regulating plans are political documents. And while we start with a recommendation that is as wed to the best future for the city that we can predict, we want to make the strongest recommendations we can. When we go through these revisions, we do it on a street-by-street basis first, and then a parcel-by-parcel basis. And so you also notice that we have these pinker zones. And these pink areas on the map are places where that building is limited to 2 stories because it's more contextually appropriate. And that's something we're able to do on a parcel-by-parcel or street basis. In the case of the walk-up, we're still allowing for the commercial use of that building's mixed use option, for that commercial use to still be controlled by the underlying zoning. And we think that's really powerful for the pattern zone because you can do this with a conventional code as long as you're willing to make a few essential tweaks, especially to your dimensional requirements, like your lot width, et cetera. Or you can do this with a form-based code. In Bryan, Texas, we ended up doing it with both. We started with a conventional code, and some of the recommendations we made for that are being codified now. And then we also had to create a form-based code that was corridor-based so that the development that would be more intense could be steered by that form-based code. So every community is going to be a little bit different. both in terms of the kinds of buildings that we select and the underlying armature that we need to work with. The pattern zone really is a new thing, and so it works with existing codes, and we designed it to work with existing codes of all types. There are quite a few more open questions that we're still exploring. In our contract with Claremore that we're executing now, they were very keen to start quickly, and they challenged us to implement a part of this program within the first 90 days. And we can do that. We can't do it with all of the building types. We can't do it with more complicated types like the walk-up because there's too much design involved. But we are able to pre-approve buildings that don't require an architectural stamp and that don't require zoning changes. So we can implement a pattern zone in a stepwise fashion so that we can get started with pilot programs very early. In fact, in Claremore, that discussion is turning now to demonstration projects where we can actually build these prototypes and have a chance to observe them in the ground and make revisions. It can be very powerful. We can talk about a lot of these questions. I'd be happy to go through these, but I know that we've been taking questions and we wanted to talk for about 30 minutes before we went to questions. But perhaps maybe the last thing I'll say before we end the formal part of this presentation is to address this middle question. This idea is merely pre-approving a building enough? And I have to be clear, you know, we get this question a lot, and even in Northwest Arkansas, where we're planning to implement these in a couple of different cities, and maybe even in a regional collaboration, we still have this question about whether or not we need to do the extra steps of the pre-approval maps or the supplementary criteria. And it's clear that even if a city was only to pre-approve the buildings, that would be a huge step up from the processes that we have now. It'd be a huge opportunity for builders, even if that was only as far as the city wanted to go. But there's so much more that can be achieved. That impact can really be multiplied with the programmatic elements. We imagine a planning desk that acts something like a sales office. If your planning clerk can suggest a pre-approved building that's acceptable to an applicant, that meets their expectations for variety, that meets their expectations for performance, you have saved, relative to the conventional permitting process, roughly 90% of the staff time that you would have needed to put into that, because you put it in on the front end, and now that scales to all of the projects going forward. And it's this notion of scale that we think is very powerful when we choose these programmatic elements to implement alongside building permit pre-approvals. We have to ask, you know, why can't some of our zoning mechanisms function as economic incentives? There's a lot of value in upzoning. That's something that cities and developers bargain with all the time. There's also a lot of, there's also, how should I say this? There is so much value in the predictability of the process and being able to have a reference standard for your city that it's hard to overstate what might happen. Our codes today function as minimum standards, and we negotiate all the time to get people to exceed those minimum standards. And we even argue about whether or not proposals actually do exceed the minimum standards, or whether they undermine them. What we have in a pattern zone with pre-approvals is something different. It's not a minimum standard. It's a reference standard. It's a reference standard. And because it's voluntary, and because the savings in time and money are so compelling, what we have instead of a race to the bottom is we have people competing in terms of how fast can they get to market. And this certainly helps people get to market faster. We have the competing in terms of how can they do better than the pattern zone, than the buildings that are pre-approved. Because if you want to do something that is custom and isn't pre-approved, it probably needs to perform better than what has been pre-approved. And that's what drives the adoption of a reference standard alongside the savings in time and money. We're eager for questions. We get a lot of questions about this every time we talk about it. We're used to some of them, but usually we get surprised too. So, Jonathan, thank you for this opportunity, and what's next?
Thank you so much, Matthew. So we do have a few questions here. First off, you mentioned making the plan in such a way that it can be useful in other states. So Mark had asked, what other areas are you able to work in and can assist outside of Northwest Arkansas and Texas? Are you doing work in other states or able to?
Yes, absolutely. With respect to providing technical assistance, we can work across the country. And with respect to providing architectural designs, I'll let Man answer that. I know that they're licensed in quite a few states.
Yeah, I forget the exact number. I think it's 30-something states that we carry licenses in, and obviously would be excited to expand that list even. So, yeah.
Okay, so within the pattern zone, do you foresee opportunity to include income restricted, affordable / attainable units?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. The longer answer is every community is going to have different goals. So if you want to, if you're a community leader and you want to prioritize affordability, we can absolutely make that a condition. What we would be careful to do is to calibrate that requirement against the savings in time and money that's provided by the pattern zone, so that we can make a compelling case for that requirement. Some cities are looking for other things that aren't related. For instance, you might be a city with a budget to do something, but you need to recoup that budget. So maybe instead of keeping permit prices low and expedited, maybe you want to charge more for it so that you can earn the money back and have some kind of a revolving fund. There's so many different ways. I don't mean to muddy the waters on the question. There are so many different ways we can use this value to advance your goals. Affordability is one of the ones that we're most excited to get an opportunity to work on.
I've got a new one here. It's from another Mark. In pattern zones, are there regulations or standards to allow for corner lots to be subdivided into 3 single homes, or does that require a rezoning and handled on a case-by-case basis?
Okay, great question. So that really depends on what the underlying code of the municipality is and what they're willing to do with it. So I mentioned before that we can do a pattern zone on top of any kind of coding regime, whether that's a form-based code or a more conventional code. It's still critical that, especially with most conventional codes, that there are some amendments that are made. So part of what we recommended in the pattern zone were changes to lot splitting rules, changes to lot width rules, and we did treat corner lots differently. We also, alongside that, got to treat access rules differently for each of the lots in the pattern zone, which we felt was critical. So the short answer is yes, but it could be kind of complicated depending on what the city is already motivated to do. In the case of Bryan, Texas, we were able to use the pattern zone as an armature to provide some different rules for expedited projects than developers of a conventionally permitted project would be able to take advantage of, like the ones you mentioned, like lot splits on a corner.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the site design criteria is one of many things that, in my opinion, makes the pattern zoning sort of an active design as opposed to like a plan book that you can find online. You know, as much time as we spent figuring out the eve return details, we probably spent way more trying to figure out how all these buildings were going to interact with typical sites in Bryan, Texas, or typical sites in Claremore or wherever else we're working.
I'll give another example for Bryan, and that was accessory dwelling units are not permitted by right in the city. There's a complicated process to gain an approval, and so no one builds them. There are a few dozen non-conforming backyard units in the city that predate the existing rules, but there's been almost nothing that's been new. But if you're willing to build one of these pre-approved buildings, and this is kind of I guess you would say this is a camel's nose under the tent scenario, that this was a foot in the door, those are permitted now. So if you can build a backyard unit by the rules of the pattern zone, and we would expect that after a couple examples have been constructed, the city will make an attempt to generalize that new allowance. And we did the same thing for pocket neighborhood formats. If you're using the pattern zone process, you can do a pocket neighborhood with these buildings, but the city as yet doesn't have a process to allow that more generally. We've recommended it, but we see the pattern zone as a way to pilot some of those changes for a community that's reticent to go all the way right away.
Well, the questions are rolling in now. So for those who missed the beginning, were you hired by the city, a developer? Can you talk about the process?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We were hired by the city in a conventional procurement process. So we responded to an RFP, did the interview, et cetera. And we were hired to do a small area plan in this case. So this is not a standalone pattern zone for Brian. It's paired with a market study, some district analysis. The market study was by RCLCO out of Austin, and they did a fantastic job. And then the district conceptualization was by Daniel Hintz at Velocity Group here in Northwest Arkansas. He took the lead there. So we did this through a conventional permitting process, and we did a whole small area plan across a 1.6 square mile area, and used the pattern zone to detail and set up a system for projects in the neighborhoods that we expect will be constructed in response to the corridor placemaking projects that the city is about to start.
Okay, so Jill asks, how do we envision transferring this concept to non-residential development?
Great question, and it's one that we're really eager to take on direct. One of the buildings that we eliminated in our second round of shortlisting was a modest commercial building, just a straightforward Main Street building that maybe could have some flex space in the rear, but is primarily a storefront building. It wasn't, it didn't make the cut on this project just because we were so editorial, but it's something that we've thought a lot about and that we really want to do. The walk-up that's already part of this project has a mixed-use option. So we've already handled, we think, most of the major components of how the program would need to be adapted for a commercial focus. The big thing is the licensing, is the architectural licensing, because almost universally, regardless of the state, buildings like that require an architectural stamp. And so there is kind of a back and forth stepwise process that has been negotiated and planned out with the city for when these projects proceed. But fundamentally, other than that, it's really not much different than what we've done for residential development. We would want to have a building type that we could detail to be flexible, both in terms of use and in terms of construction. And we would want to have some commercially oriented site criteria instead of, in this case, what you're seeing are, what we had to do were site criteria that were predominantly oriented towards residential neighborhood development. So changing the site criteria and being careful of to make a commercial building flexible would be the two major things that we would want to be aware of.
I would add to that too. You know, we've tried to stay really focused on kind of the fundamental goal here, which is about incremental development and development at a certain scale. And we've found that, you know, when we start pushing the boundary too far and getting into project types that require too much approval and too much, you know, licensed engineers and architects, we found that not only does that create complications, but it also is just sort of a problem that we're not trying to solve. You know, we're not trying to help the developers out who already have teams of land use lawyers. You know, we're kind of trying to help the small guy out with this program. So a lot of things work better when we sort of stay in our lane and stay under those thresholds.
So
I should add to that because I think this is really important. You know, we have a philosophy that small projects deserve little or should get little or no review, like a single family house or a renovation at the extreme end of the small scale, and large projects should get a robust review. Very large scale projects, of course, should get reviewed very closely. And we can all agree with that. But there's a third piece, which is modest projects. Modest projects should get a modest review. And in most of our cities, that just doesn't happen. A triplex is treated the same way as a 300-plex for most of our cities in the zoning and in the building code. And so that's what we've tried to do here, is provide a modest review process for modest projects. So to Matt's point, just to put a button on it, we don't think that a pattern zone should or even could be implemented for very large scale projects.
interesting. So speaking of the little guy and architectural stamps, have you had any pushback from the architectural community, you know, basically saying, what are you doing to us?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually had a really awesome stakeholder group meeting with a group of about 20 architects when we were first developing this concept in Bryan. And what we found out is that they're actually excited about this because most of the pattern zone deals with buildings that they don't get to touch, right? So, you know, if the Architectural Act doesn't require an architect to stamp a duplex, which it doesn't in most states, then architects don't get to design those projects, and they end up just being designed, you know, people just build them off of plan books from online, or builders kind of draw them. So the architects that we've talked to see it as an opportunity to get design thinking into building types that wouldn't otherwise have it regularly. And then, as I've mentioned, there are some, depending on what mix of patterns we do, especially the walk-up does rise above that threshold. And there's a very clear line there where, you know, it becomes necessary to involve local architecture firms. And I think they were excited to be able to be involved in that as well.
So this ties in two questions. Can you talk about public input and how often new designs could be added to the options to make it, you know, to prevent what eventually starts to feel very cookie cutter?
Absolutely. So the first question, we had a very robust public engagement work plan on this project, especially since we were doing what is essentially a comprehensive plan for a large area of the city. With respect to the pattern zone itself, we think it's really critical that the pre-approved buildings are familiar to the community. And the only way to make sure that those buildings are going to be familiar is to learn what the public loves and cherishes in their community already. And so we started with a photographic survey and a visual preference survey, just to compare and contrast and understand what people prefer and what people already love. And those are what Matt used to enter into the design and to kick off the design. We also had a lot of input about the pre-approval maps. And that's why we start from an idealized map and then move to street by street revisions and then parcel by parcel revisions, because we want to make sure that these are pre-approved in places that are contextually appropriate, especially because those pre-approval maps may look different than the underlying zoning maps. We've pre-approved that walk-up building in places where only single family development is allowed today. And we're able to do that because we could show the community exactly what those building options looked like. That was really powerful in the public engagement. Jonathan, what was the second part of that question?
Well, how, in order to prevent a sense of...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Matt mentioned that the question we get most often is how do we ensure variability? So we have a couple of thoughts about that. First, we think it's important. Second, frankly, it seems like the concern is sometimes overstated. We have a lot of experiences visiting main streets And we've noticed that almost every main street looks the same. We still like them.
Yeah.
I haven't met anybody who has traveled to a European city like Paris or Edinburgh or anywhere else and come home and said, I'm never going back. The buildings look all the same.
Mhm.
So there are different kinds of sameness. There's sameness that's boring, like the ticky-tackies written about in the song 30 years ago. Sorry to date people in the audience if you remember that song about suburbia. There's also a sameness that is really familiar, and we cherish familiarity. We cherish things that are recognizable, but different enough to catch our eyes. Those variations on a theme are really important. Now, all that's to say, we are interested. It's an open question for how a pattern zone should be managed long-term, because this is the first one. And so we have discussed whether or not buildings should be decommissioned after they've been constructed a certain number of times, or they've been constructed a certain number of times within a certain area, and how buildings should be added back in. And we don't have any hard and fast answers on that. A lot of that is dependent on the community and how well the program gets used. We envision that in a really active pattern zone, you would see buildings rotated off and new ones rotated on something like a 5 to 6 year basis. But there's one thing that we should caution against. You don't want to have too many buildings, because that makes the program more complicated to administer, and that goes against our mission with what we've done here. And optionality also can sometimes be paralyzing for the general public if they have too many easy options. And that speaks, I think, to one of our broader goals, which is to expand the market of people who can execute developments. You know, we see a market for pattern zones with traditional builders and developers. If you're a home builder and you're building 40 homes a year, we would hope that in a community with a pattern zone that you might choose to take a quarter or a third of your annual portfolio and do something that was a little bit more intense than single family structures alone. Or if, so that's one market. We think that's a huge market, maybe the predominant market, but also there's a whole set of people in our communities that want to execute projects that never get the chance because they don't have access to the knowledge or the people that they need to execute a development. We don't think that it's necessarily right that you have to know who a great engineer and a great architect is, and you already have to have a lender in mind to execute a project. We are frustrated sometimes that communities go to such great lengths to understand and to detail the vision their residents have for their communities, but then they don't have any systems in place that allow those residents to actually execute any project, not even one. But I guarantee there are people in almost every neighborhood that have a nest egg or a double lot and a desire to do something. And so what we've tried to do here is really radically lower barriers to infill projects so that anybody with a will can execute something like what you've seen.
So we got a great question from our friend Richard in Oklahoma City. He says, we've got a form-based code in place for the center city in Norman, Oklahoma. And we need to take this step to make it easier to get what we want built. So what should a community budget to implement something like this?
It's a great question, and of course one that we love to get asked. And the answer is it depends on how much you want to do. So on a per building basis, this is more expensive than a one-off because we have all of the variations in place and because we're licensing them to be used over and over again. Compared to a normal planning project, the costs are basically on par. If you want to price out something like this and start to pull together a preliminary budget, you can look to any neighborhood plan or small area plan or comp plan that you've done in the past, and the scope of works usually come out to be roughly the same amount of hours.
Okay, thank you. So in your experience so far, do you see the utilization of the pattern zoning benefiting developers or individuals? Seasoned guys or newbies?
Yeah, the answer is both, and I'm glad to get that question because that's something that I look for opportunities to talk more about. And just a few minutes ago, that's what I was trying to get at when we talk about the market for using a pattern zone. Seasoned developers that are doing large-scale projects are probably not the primary market. Production home builders, people who are doing downtown development, especially in small towns or in satellite communities, that's the scale that a pattern zone really works well at. And somebody who already has some experience in the development sector is going to be one of the best candidates to step in to use that program, whether they're a contractor who wants to make a move on their own, a developer who pulls deals together, or an architect who's been on the design side for a few years or for part of a career. Those people are going to be great. That's the primary market. But I can't give that answer without saying that there's a huge untapped market of smart people who aren't in the sector at all, but who want to pull off a project. They can't right now just because it's so darn complicated. And it is. I mean, it's super complicated. That's why developer fees, that's why we can earn developer fees if you're a developer. It's because that is really hard work to make something out of that chaos. That's something that takes a lot of specialized knowledge and skill to pull off. With this, we've tried to remove at least with respect to the design, with respect to the site, and with the building, we've tried to remove those barriers so that everyday smart people can pull off these projects. And it's hard for us to estimate what the size of that market is because there's virtually no city in America that has a system in place where people like that can actually execute projects.
So similar question. This comes from a planner, and Mark Zitzow. Similar question. Can a developer designing a large-scale greenfield neighborhood use the pattern zone plans if they meet the site standards?
So this is one that we have wrestled with. You know, I think we'll be honest with you that some days we have different opinions about how to answer that question. As planners, we can see how the program could potentially be abused if we were to allow that to take place, but we're also optimistic that we could implement a system that would prevent those kinds of abuses. So we're not sure yet, and you know, after I say my piece, I'd really like to get Matt to weigh in with some of his thoughts. My instinct has been that we should find a way to allow that to happen. That probably means imposing some requirements for variability, and it means being very strict with how those plats can be laid out. We don't want the pattern zone to be used to build new examples of suburban and urban formats which are underperforming. The pattern zone needs to be used for projects that enhance the performance of our land uses. Of course, that's a lot easier to do with infill projects where services and infrastructure already exist. But I'm personally optimistic that we could find a way to allow it for large greenfield sites as well.
Yeah, I want to take that on too. So I mentioned, you know, pattern zoning is a planning process. It's a design process. It is not a plan book that you can just simply spread across an area. And one of the ways we accomplish that, one of the reasons we do that, is that we are always trying to address a certain question or address a certain problem. So in Midtown and Bryan, there simply aren't those large parcels where someone could aggregate a bunch of space and build a whole, you know, new single family neighborhood out of flex houses, for example. So that was really about addressing infill on a parcel by parcel basis. But you could have a city that might come in and say, hey, you know, the issue that we would like a pattern zone to address is getting a higher level of design and walkability within new greenfield neighborhoods. And we could tool a pattern zone specifically to address that that issue by focusing the building types on that and focusing the lot diagrams on that. And as Matt mentioned, we are developing, ways to guard against abuses. So for example, we've got the supplemental criteria. So we've got the pattern book with the building plans, we've got the site designs, and then we've got the supplemental criteria. And what the supplemental criteria can do is say things like, basically require a certain amount of variability within a proximate area. So if you've got, a dozen lots of that you want to build flex houses on, how many variations within a certain distance of each other are you required to have? So we've been looking at ideas like that. And I think we ended up building some of that in to the Bryan supplemental criteria.
Yes, we did. We've got a prototype there. And this question is interesting to us for another reason. And that's because one of the examples out there that predates pattern zones that we were inspired by are traditional neighborhood developments and even regular conventional suburban developments. How do those subdivision developers or T&D developers work? Well, they themselves, from a sales point of view, pre-approve a set of buildings. And when they're doing lot sales out of the sales office, they are telling people who come in the door, these are the homes we will allow you to build. And a lot of them, of course, have a process set up. If you want to do something custom, they have a list of architects you're allowed to work with, or so on and so forth, but they still want to have approval. So this question is interesting because that is one of the things we set out to do, was to municipalize that approach, to take that inspiration from the private sector, which is done to expedite their sales process and to make sure that the neighborhoods that they're building hold value for future sales. How do we municipalize that so it can be done at a scale that is much bigger than a single neighborhood? It's one of the reasons we did this. It's a great question.
Okay, so does your team provide training on how to tailor and implement these pattern zones, or would you need to, they're asking if they would just need to hire you in this other in municipalities that may not be working with you?
Yeah, so we are approaching pattern zones and working on pattern zones in multiple ways. Of course, we're eager to be a direct hire and to do jobs. Our consideration about that question would largely be capacity oriented. So what's our capacity for the existing timeline? If somebody wants to forge ahead on their own, of course, there's nothing we could do to stop you from taking inspiration from what we've done. And our instinct would be to celebrate you for doing something that's going to make your communities better. If we, for some reason, didn't have the capacity to take on an entire project, we would be eager to provide some consultation and some assistance to make sure that you avoided some of the pitfalls that we found along the way, and to make sure that you're getting a pattern zone that's going to be the best it can be for your community. So that's a long answer. The short answer is we want to make sure communities can get better, and we want to be directly involved in helping communities get better however we can.
Yeah, we're also interested in sort of finding new applications for the pattern zone. So for example, most of the towns that we've worked in right now have been sort of a college town sort of size, a typical college town size. I think we're interested in figuring out how this might apply in much larger contexts, sort of the typical capital city type context. But also we've had some preliminary discussions with some real small delta towns here in Arkansas that basically have no capacity. They don't even have planning departments. And we think this might be a great technology for them to invest in as well. So we're kind of open to figuring out new applications.
Yeah, so speaking of college towns, do you have any cases or have seen any cases where you've got people chasing that student housing and where they've been able to benefit from this?
Well, Bryan, Texas, actually, that's how this got started. And tell you a little about Bryan College Station, that metro. There's 200,000 people between the two cities. 90,000 of them are students. So it's an incredibly pointed. It's a sharp dynamic with respect to the town and gown. And Matt mentioned this earlier. We got brought in because they wanted to find a way to meet their housing demand that didn't use stealth dorms. That didn't use these 5-bedroom, 5-bath, single family by technicality houses. And so we think we did that. When it comes down to, you know, these communities that are like this, they're struggling because they can see the problem, but they don't have an existing mechanism to solve it very well. That's why they needed something that was a little bit different. In Bryan, for instance, they had done an enforcement survey and discovered that the stealth dorms were generating enforcement calls at a rate of about 10 times that of a conventional multifamily property. 10 times. So we theorized that was in part because of the building format. Conventional multifamily property is managed and it has separate units. A stealth dorm has 5 bedrooms and a communal kitchen, and it's not managed really, it's managed minimally. So we got brought in to try and solve that because they do have an incredible demand that's not going away. We think that can be applied to a lot of other cities and a lot of other circumstances. Even in Bryan, Texas, whenever we got in there and did the market analysis, we actually found that students aren't the primary growth demographic. It's young professionals. And the city leaders were stunned. We were stunned. But we actually came in to do more or less better student housing in a comprehensive manner. And we ended up, through a process of discovery, realizing that the entire community needed a lot of the same kind of help.
Okay, 2 questions here regarding land. I'm sorry, at first I was concerned we weren't going to have questions, and now I'm having trouble managing them. So, okay, so first, does this concept work on unplatted land? Thoughts about how the concepts interact with platting? And then 2, how do you anticipate pre-approved engineering when civil is so site specific?
Great questions. Absolutely great questions. Okay, so with unplatted land, you have to plat in order to use the expedited permit. We want each building to be on its own parcel. And that's for ease of enforceability and interpretation of the supplementary site criteria. We do have some flexibility for that for other formats, like the pocket neighborhood format. Those aren't conventional parcels. But it's more or less a requirement that each building needs to be on its own parcel. If we take away that requirement, it just becomes a lot more complicated to evaluate sites, and we wanted to make sure that this is very, very easy for staff to do a project review with. Pre-approved engineering drawings is an avenue that we are eager to tackle. With respect to MEP drawings and the like, we think with the right client, this is primarily a budgetary concern, but if we had the budget, it would be very straightforward to extend this scope from architecture into any of the engineering that needs to be done for the vertical construction. Whoever asked the question is exactly right. It's astute to note that the civil engineering is site specific. We don't see a way forward to pre-approve that right now. That's why we turn to the supplementary site criteria, because we still think that there needs to be some project review for the site development. But even putting aside that we believe that, it's just a fact. Soil conditions vary. Hydrology varies. You just can't get around needing to deal with that stuff on a case-by-case basis for so much of the civil. Now that's to say, we can tell you how wide a driveway needs to be and where it should be and what the curb radius should be. We can prescribe a lot of that so that at least at a schematic level, any applicant, even somebody who isn't trained in design, any applicant should be able to look at the pattern book and the diagrams and the site criteria and see more or less what a conceptual site layout is going to be before they go to the civil. Matt, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I want to talk about the site engineering, because it's a really good question. And the thing that I would go back to is, just to say that the problem that we were asked to solve specifically in Bryan was almost 2 square miles. I could certainly imagine a pattern zone happening at a very different scale. So for example, what if someone wanted us to solve for just a few city blocks near their downtown? That becomes much more, I can envision, being able to get much more specific with regard to engineering at a smaller scale like that.
Well, the questions have stopped rolling in. I want to thank you all so much. I find it just absolutely fascinating, and I want to see it here in Tulsa like tomorrow. So thank you, all of you who were in attendance today. Thank you again to our sponsors, the Matts, Matt Hoffman and Matthew Petty. Thank you to you, Maddie DeBee and Michelle Macbeth in Oklahoma City. This has been fascinating. I think that it went well enough that we ought to share this with everyone. So with that, I wish you well and goodbye.